handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Denise Simon Experience. Very happy that you could join the information train here. I had to pull somebody off an airplane. Kind of, sort of. Ryan Mauro, he's been with us before on the Denise Simon Experience. And if you need a refresher, he is the National Security Terrorism Analyst at the Clarion Project and does remarkable work. And he's one of these guys that not only is he doing the work here, but he literally gets on a plane and travels on over to where the action is happening so he can see people and talk to people and see consequences firsthand. So, Ryan, first of all, thanks for your travels and thanks for the constant good work that you do. And thanks for being on the Denise Simon Experience. I want to start off with this because I was a little concerned that last month, Andrew Parker, who is the top gun, he's the chief of MI5 in Britain. He put out a statement, pretty extensive one, which was really unheard of. I mean, he literally kind of stood up and did a filibuster, saying that Europe and certainly Britain is seeing the worst terror threat ever that he has seen in his 34 years in the industry. Well, yeah. I would like to say congratulations, Andrew Parker. You broke the code. But something tells me that there was really a catalyst. There was something that really struck him that he needed to come out and make this statement. And I would say the statement was really to the Britain government that they're not doing enough. I think the intelligence people are. In some form or fashion, mostly because we help them too. But it's the government, it's the leadership, it's the parliament that doesn't seem to want to take these things seriously. Where did I get that wrong?
I don't think you're wrong. I think there were probably two main reasons that these statements were made. The first is from the policy perspective to say, look, you need to do something on the broader issue of a lack of assimilation by all the Muslim population that is coming into Europe. And that becomes a breeding ground for extremism, and then from that extremist pool, you get terrorists. And whereas in the U.S., the Muslim population is still very small. It's growing, but it's small, and there's a high level of assimilation. But we can see what damage is done just by a few extremists. Look over at Europe, you're dealing with a much, much, much larger Muslim population with much, much higher levels of extremism and much, much higher levels of actual terrorists. And it's gotten to a position now where no one's really crafting ideas on what you do about those communities. There's been some speeches made, and there's been some minor initiatives, but I wouldn't say a real detailed strategy. So I think the first thing he was trying to do is impact policy in that direction beyond ISIS. The second reason, I think this is the bigger reason because it's more immediate, is the fact that thousands of people who joined or sought to join ISIS and other groups fighting in the conflicts in Iraq and Syria are returning home, and especially to Europe. And there's only so much monitoring that a European intelligence service can do. People think that if your name is in a database and they have your address, that the problem's essentially taken care of. They're wiretapping your phone. They're watching everywhere you go. couldn't be further from the truth. That's the resources don't exist for that, and I think that that's where the panic is coming from, and it is true panic because you're dealing with thousands of people that aspire to join ISIS that are now back home, have citizenship, are familiar with the local communities. That it's a situation that's just destined to explode.
Ryan, what I think people don't necessarily understand too, because Britain is such a close ally, that we think that they have essentially the same kind of law basis that we do here in America. And that is far from the truth. First of all, they have laws protecting individual citizens' privacy that are much more robust and stout than ours are. The second thing is that if you're in the European Union, then you have a European Union court legal system, and countries don't have individual laws or penalties, correct?
Somewhat, yeah. So you get thrown into an international bureaucratic system. So prosecutions and cross-border cooperation just becomes that much more difficult.
So when you can just kind of travel freely and you can go from, Scotland to Sweden to Germany to France to Italy, I would say the coordination between intelligence leaderships in each of those countries is probably almost so bureaucratic and so big and so cumbersome that it's almost an impossibility from a counterterrorism standpoint. Right?
It is an impossible task. Your measure of success is stopping something from happening, so it's very difficult for you to show that you're being successful because you can't point to something. But then the other side, the enemy, just has to point to even an arrest, a near plot, is somewhat of a victory for them because that scares the daylights out of people. I mean, if you stop a terrorist just before he puts a bomb in a backpack and gets onto a bus, yeah, you could say you foiled the plot, but which side is stronger after that happens? It's actually the terrorist side still. And so we have I think, a mistaken measure of success. The foil plot somehow means a victory. It doesn't. Victory is when you kill an enemy leader, you destroy a safe haven, you win on the battlefield. It's not a foiled plot. And so it is an impossible situation. The European laws are interesting in that you correctly said that there's these wide-ranging privacy laws and there's bureaucratic systems that then make them weaker, but then they're stronger in certain areas where they can prosecute you for doing things like inciting hatred, these very vague terms. You can have your nonprofit shut down in the UK for spreading hatred, and so that the free speech is something you can be held accountable for. They don't have the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah,
so it's a different balance than what we have. And I think you can get into the argument about who has the better balance, but the fact of the matter is we have the Constitution and our own court precedents here, and that's not changing, and it's also not changing in Europe.
Well, you can get in trouble for just wearing, a political sweatshirt over there in London, for instance, and over here we're almost there.
Well, I'm reminded of when the French did something that a lot of activists in this topic supported, but I thought was just stupid. Was when the French banned the Muslim hijab from the schools because they said they want to be so secular that you can't have a cross, you can't have any type of religious expression as an individual, and so you can't have the headdress on if you're a Muslim girl. And there was outrage in the Muslim world, not an attack or anything, and I thought that was stupid and counterproductive, but that gives you an idea of how much further reaching European law can be, even if it's weaker in another area. And sometimes the way they use those far-reaching powers is just not, it's just not wise, not worth the time. The other point I would make is that in regards to how if you get a European Union visa, you can just skip around from one country to the next. That's obviously very good for terrorists, but compare that to the U.S. So you say you're a Somali and you sneak into the U.S. over the Mexican border, or you come in legally. Well, you then can go to a Somali community, which are still small enough that we're going to have a good idea where you are and where you're hiding, and there's a good chance that you're going to run into someone that we're wiretapping if you're a bad guy, and we're going to find you out that way. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Europe, you have so many immigrant populations that you can be an Albanian or someone from Africa or someone from South America. There's always going to be a community for you to get into, and there's so many of them that there's a layer of protection that doesn't exist in the U.S. In the U.S., if you're doing a counterterrorism investigation, you say, I'm worried about this group of Somalis, you know where to go. You probably have resources to do some monitoring, although it's not enough. And in Europe, it's just much, much worse because these communities are larger. There's many of them. There's so many immigrants. And so Europe's in much worse condition than we have. We have the same exact trends, by the way, but the trends it's going to take a long time, decades, before we get into a situation comparable to Europe. So we still have time to learn from their mistakes and learn from whatever successes they may come up with.
Look, since we've had Brussels and we've had Paris and, Britain, certainly London, Manchester, is Europe learning any of these lessons? I mean, again, I think it's the intelligence people maybe, and they can maybe craft some kind of a mission or objective that might be indeed viable. But I also think that they would necessarily get watered down because they know that, their legislative bodies just won't accept it. And the reason I say that is because if you look at their prison times, Ryan, their prison times for the like crimes over here are nothing. I mean, you get, you're, a supporter giving fundamental support to jihad here in the United States is going to go away 10 years. Over there, right, it's going to be 3 years, but we'll give you, 12 months, 14 months because you've been such a good boy.
Yeah, they're much lighter. European culture when it comes to the criminal justice system is the opposite of the U.S. It's focused more on rehabilitation, and I think that more broadly speaking, they have stuff that we could learn from, but when it comes to the issue of terrorism, not so much. But the problem is that there's no template for any of us to adopt. We may have longer prison sentences, but we still have the problem of radicalization and the skills that a criminal naturally acquires being in the prison system and then having those when they are released. And Europe is grappling with the same thing. What we have going for us is that with the longer prison sentences is that people are less likely to become a terrorist the older they are. And so if you throw in a 30-year-old for 10 years and he comes out in his 40s, much less likely to become a terrorist. But if it's in Europe and you lock them up for 3 years, well, they're still in that primary age range where they do become a violent jihadist. And so that's the real big difference there. And there's going to have to be, and Europe's closer to doing this than we are because their conversation is more advanced because of the higher level of a threat, but there's going to have to be ultimately a national and then international framework for basically all government institutions and how to identify and ferret out Islamists. And it'll get to the point where once that ideology is more clearly defined in a way acceptable to the powers that be, the standard won't be anymore that, look, under the names of freedom of religion and freedom of political thought, you can have a subversive ideology and work in the prison system. It's common sense. We should kick you out for that. If you're not an American citizen especially, we should just kick you out of the country altogether, as far as I'm concerned. I know some law students, I said that on Fox once, and some law students were emailing me and saying, oh, well, if you're a resident, legally you can't do that. All right, well, then change the law. If you're a resident, if you're not a citizen, and we catch you in any context expressing support for suicide bombers or anything really anti-American or subversive, we just kick them out. But in the meantime, those protections, I would argue, for non-residents do not exist. So let's start there. Very often you look at the wiretaps of like an ISIS suspect, and you'll see all this radical anti-American pro-terrorist rhetoric being recorded that they can't be prosecuted for. In my mind, well, if that's the case, look into throwing them out of the country if they're not a resident or American citizen. And I haven't heard of that ever happening.
Yeah, me neither. It all really kind of scares me. They take it so lightly there. What other lessons that are learned? I mean, we do a pretty good job over here, I think, of, you know, the Joint Terrorism Task Force and certainly NYPD being the premier police force. I think we do a pretty good job of necessarily cultivating some of these issues and studying them. I mean, we can't put, you know, I would say surveillance teams on everybody, because I mean, it takes like 24 people to be assigned to, you know, track one person or tail one person for, you know, 6 months or so. But I'm not convinced that some of our lessons learned that they're learning them. But what are they learning over there that has come to your attention?
The fact that they'll shut down nonprofits for advocating hatred, I mean, it's not a right to have a nonprofit. That's a privilege. I think that's fair game to hold someone accountable for how they operate as a nonprofit. And even if it's constitutionally protected speech, you can't be prosecuted for, well, it doesn't necessarily mean that you get the privileges of a nonprofit. In Europe, they've already come to that conclusion. They'll shut down a nonprofit that is supporting Islamic extremism, but then they'll open up a new one, but at least then there's a paper trail there, and at least you're doing something to disrupt their activities. The national conversation in Europe is much more advanced. You'll hear terms like muscular liberalism. You're hearing more talk about assimilation and trying to come up with policies that really do zero in on the Islamist ideology without victimizing innocent Muslims, and how to do that. Part of that is that European leadership is just more articulate than American. I mean, it's just, you look at speeches that have been done by the leaders of France, Italy, the UK in discussing this issue, and it blows away anything that an American leader says on it. And I don't know if that's just because we're more dumbed down in America, it's a cultural difference or what it is, but that contrast is there. And so it's part, whatever the reason is, at least in terms of the public discussion and what leaders are saying, it's a mile ahead of most of what we've heard. Trump has said some good speeches that speechwriters put together, but still, the European leadership, at least the conversation is where it needs to be. And now the question is, what policies follow? And that's obviously the more difficult part of the conversation, but at least they've gone over there, whereas we're still debating, we're still arguing over semantics, and we haven't progressed much further since, like, September 12th, 2001.
Well, they still speak the King's English over there in some form or fashion, and we're a little more slang over here, but yet we've injected a whole bunch of political correctness that we have to choose our words pretty carefully over here.
Well, yeah, it's political correctness, but also, I mean, how many Americans can define assimilation? I mean the content of the conversations happening in Europe is just over the heads of most Americans. It just is. Some people might be offended by that, but I challenge you to look up speeches by Tony Blair and David Cameron and the other European leaders and find a comparative American leader, and you'll see my point.
You know, when it comes to Islamic State, we have seen now that social media is beginning to address some of the issues and taking down videos and challenging, you know, their terms of service on some of the recruiting and some of the, you know, sermons and all those kinds of things. So as a consequence, I would say that Al-Qaeda and all of their factions have been, you know, sitting back being very, very patient and watching the successes and the failures of Islamic State. And hence, I think both factions are changing tactics. Did I get any of that right?
Yeah, that's right. The issue with Al-Qaeda, and this is especially clear from the documents we got from bin Laden's compound, is an organization that's willing to learn and adapt. And they have more of a gray area where debates happen in terms of what tactics are permissible and which ones are the most pragmatic to use that doesn't exist with ISIS. And so there was a debate within the jihadi world after the U.S. invaded Iraq and those really gruesome beheadings became commonplace and they were killing other Muslims. There was a big debate within the jihadi world about what is permissible and what is wise to do. And ISIS ultimately came along and vindicated the most vicious arguments because they were so vicious and so inhumane, and they had just incredible success in what it felt like overnight. But now they're losing. They're just about extinguished as a terrorist group that controls territory, which is what their premise is based on. So the safe answer is to always say, oh, the threat's not going away because there's always a supporter out there. Yeah, of course. But you look at what ISIS was and what they are now. I think they're basically done until another group comes along. And what Al-Qaeda has done is sat back and looked at how ISIS rose and how ISIS fell. And they're learning that they need to invest more in social services. Bin Laden told his affiliates, don't give any evidence that you're connected to me because there's a backlash, and you need to appease donors. They almost like a nonprofit in that regard, or a business. And you just see a lot more thought and creativity going into those types of things, and that's why in Syria especially, Al-Qaeda is being monumentally successful. If you think ISIS was bad, wait until Al-Qaeda really gets rolling in Syria, because they have about a 20,000-man army, an actual army, that other jihadist groups have now all rallied behind, and they're politically popular. They've got social services going on. They've learned from ISIS propaganda. They've learned not to go too far to the point where they alienate locals or arouse international attention to a counterproductive degree. What you're going to see next is a much smarter, more effective Al-Qaeda, and you're going to see commentators on TV eventually saying, boy, I miss the days when we were dealing with a group like ISIS that had weaknesses we could exploit.
All right, so you have just come off a trip to Saudi Arabia, and we got some interesting things going on in the kingdom. And a lot of people don't necessarily understand that one of the generational nemesises, is that a word, of Saudi Arabia is Iran, as it is for us. But I think, the bad history is sitting more with Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then we have the Lebanon-Yemen thing. It is the kingdom. I know that they've put out something called Vision 2020 or 2030, I think it was.
2030.
2030. That they were going to kind of renaissance Saudi Arabia. And I think that's probably a good thing. We've seen that they've moderated here a little bit. Women get to drive and, whatever else they're going to get to do. And the Wahhabi faction, I think, is kind of being sidelined a little bit. I get that. I could be wrong. But there's a real challenge here that I don't think has been fully realized and as consequent explained on what Iran is really doing to Saudi Arabia, and is Saudi Arabia fully prepared for what may come? And I would say maybe the battlefield might be Lebanon. What did I get wrong there?
Nothing really wrong. The only thing I would add is that having been to Saudi Arabia twice, once in January and then once most recently, I just got back, I'm already seeing positive change. I know that there's a lot of experts out there that are just saying, look, the Saudis are Wahhabist and they're not rejecting Sharia law, so this is all just a show. I think there's a lot more nuance in there than they give credit for. No, they're not going to reject Sharia law altogether. No, they're not going to allow alcohol. But my standard for success is progress in the right direction, and I am seeing that. I'm seeing more gender mixing. Women wouldn't give you eye contact, especially as a non-Muslim in January. I'm seeing it much more. It's a different environment, and I've got to tell you, the crackdown on the major political figures and religious figures, which didn't get as much coverage in Saudi Arabia, is something that's being very positively received by the Saudi population I encountered, particularly the young people. It's a very young population, very eager for westernization, very eager to have less censorship, and the country as a whole is very eager to have more jobs and the business opportunities that come with becoming westernized. The extremist religious establishment is divided between those that for years and years have preached jihad against the West, except for the Saudi royal family. They basically found a way to say attack everyone, but not the Saudi royal family. And then there are those that are more consistent and say, look, obviously the Saudi royal family needs to go. But the Crown Prince is exploiting that divide. The future, I think, is, I mean, he could be overthrown. If he goes too far, you could see a lot of civil conflict. Iran could easily stir up internal revolutionaries. But based on what I saw happening there and the massive amount of advertisements for Vision 2030, I'm actually optimistic that we have a chance here that the Crown Prince will move Saudi Arabia into a much more positive direction, obviously not reaching the standards of those that want them to become like America in 2017 and not have any extremist involvement at all. But, I mean, they want to leap forward very, very much so. The question is what the response to that is going to be from the religious establishment. But I think I've been impressed with at least the statements and some of the actions so far of the Crown Prince. But still, he's a Saudi leader, and you know, you got to be cynical based on their history.
Ladies and gentlemen, travel on over to the Clarion Project and watch what they're doing. They're putting up stuff virtually every day that is right on the money. And glad you're back. And thanks, Ryan Mauro, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. Come back.
All right. I look forward to it. Thanks.
Thanks. More coming your way, ladies and gentlemen.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times. Hi, I'm Ward Cleaver.
And I'm June Cleaver.
From Leave It to Beaver. And you're listening to Talk America Radio.
Ward, aren't you a little tough on the beaver?
No, we can't say that. Do it again.
She said it on the show. That's where it came from. It was 30 years ago.
All right, let's try it again. Hi, I'm Ward Cleaver.
And I'm June Cleaver.
Try it again. Don't laugh. Okay, game face.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ward Cleaver.
And I'm June Cleaver.
From the hit show Leave It to Beaver. And you're listening to Talk America Radio.
Ward, don't you think you're being a little hard on the beaver?
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia. And WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. We get to talk about the First Amendment. Oy. And I am delighted to be joined by Oliver Dunford, who is a stellar lawyer over there at my favorite law firm, the Pacific Legal Foundation. So, Oliver, thanks for joining in, and can't wait to kind of talk about this topic because it's one that has a lot of far-reaching consequences.
Yeah, it does, and thanks so much for having me on.
We have this case in Minnesota, and I would argue the case is actually probably in several other states too, or necessarily been challenged, but you can correct me on that.
No.
You go to a voting poll, but you have to watch out what you wear.
Right.
And Minnesota I think with a couple other states, maybe, I don't know, almost a dozen or so, have restrictions on what you can wear. Because we don't want to cause confusion and undue influence. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's about right. And you're right. There are, in addition to Minnesota, there are 9 other states that have similar bans. And the Minnesota statute says that you can't wear anything political, but that's been so widely applied and construed that it covers just about anything. And the official policy of the state, which was handed down from the Secretary of State down to the local counties and then to the election judges, said that political included anything like including the name of a political party, so Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, and also, and this is where our clients come in, it said any material promoting a group with recognizable political views, such as the Tea Party and MoveOn.org. So it applies across the board.
All right. Well, we know that we can't have signs and we can't have people standing within, I don't know, X number of feet or X number of yards from the polling location. I got that. All right. So we've already infringed on, I guess, free speech there, right?
Somewhat, yes. The general rules are the closer you get to the polling place, the more restrictions are permitted. So anyone who's voted knows when you walk towards the building where you're going to vote, people are passing out flyers and talking to you, and then at some point they have to stop that. And then from there, inside the polling place, basically there's not supposed to be any interruption. So, and we don't contest, for example, that anybody should be allowed in the polling place with a bullhorn or, like you said, huge signs that they're waving around and getting in people's way. That kind of conduct, which we've described as campaigning or electioneering, is different than what we're protecting here, which is what we've described as passive political speech. So something you're wearing, a T-shirt, a cap, a button, those kinds of things do not disrupt anyone else at the polling place. No one who was wearing those shirts is going up, bothering people while they're voting. All they were doing was wearing, quote-unquote, political apparel.
Oliver, Oliver.
I know.
Okay, here's the deal. So we have this cockamamie law, and I would argue, I'm guessing because I haven't read the laws of these 10 states, Texas, New Jersey, Delaware, the rest of them, but so we can't wear a hat, we can't wear a button, we can't wear a pin, we can't wear a T-shirt, we can't wear a banner, we can't do blah, 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 blah. All right, because we don't want to cause confusion or undue influence. Now, I want to go back to the confusion and undue influence because people are getting ready to do the most sacrosanct thing that we have, and that is voting. And if they're confused or they're influenced, I would argue they probably shouldn't be voting to start with.
Well,
is that just a rhetorical kind of thing?
Yeah, and as we've, I think it's on our website. There's a video of the lead attorney in this case is named Wen Fa, and he's got a great video where he shows that it's possible that the state could say nobody can wear a blue shirt because that would be representing the Democrats, and no one can wear a red shirt because that would be representing the Republicans. So basically, you can show up apparently in a gray T-shirt and jeans, and then you're okay.
Okay, Oliver. So if we can't, wear a red shirt and perhaps even a blue shirt and all the other things, is the next step we can't talk to the next person standing next to us either because it might cause confusion or undue influence? So it has to be like a library. We can't talk and don't write any notes and hand it off to anybody either?
Well, arguably, if you're inside the voting, if you're obviously certainly if you're in the process of voting, no one should be talking to you or passing you anything. Otherwise, yeah, I've talked to people on the way into the voting booth, and I think
while you're standing in line for 2 hours.
Right, and so I think the rule there is, so long as you're not bothering anybody. I mean, if once you get closer and closer, obviously you want to be respectful, if nothing else. But that goes to the conduct, not to the expression. wearing a button that carries a political expression is speech. Whereas if you're just talking about the football game over the weekend, you're doing it loudly. That kind of expression is not the kind of expression that we're talking about that's being infringed here. We're talking about passive speech that does not bother anyone or infringe their right to vote.
Okay, so we got Johnny standing next to us, and we bring up the fact that we've got an issue with the VA, or we've got an issue with the policy as it relates to what we're doing in Sudan. And then the conversation kind of winds its way, because you got two to hold a conversation, and it winds its way over into, well, such and such is doing this. You see what I'm saying? I mean, yeah, I almost see you're not trying to campaign, but you kind of get deeper into the conversation, and all of a sudden you can't do that either.
Right, and that would be, like you said, if you're walking around handing out leaflets inside the polling
sure.
place, and yeah, if you're discussing policy. It becomes a closer call. It becomes a very difficult call on where to draw that line between merely discussing politics with the person in line with you and campaigning. But nonetheless, that's a closer call and far removed from what we're trying to protect here. And you mentioned the VA, but this would apply to people who want to wear like a Sierra Club shirt or a NRA hat or a NAACP, AFL-CIO. So this really would apply to both sides of the spectrum. And what we argue is that this, instead of being a reasonable restriction to protect the integrity of the polling place, Minnesota and states like it are basically creating a complete speech-free zone inside the polling place.
Okay, so what is the consequence if you have been a bad little girl and you go in there with a red shirt on and you refuse to leave? What do? They call the polling people, and then they have a confrontation there, and you say, I'm here to vote. This is just happens to be the only clean T-shirt I had. Well, too bad. You have to go home and change it or go buy another one or whatever. And then you go, no, I'm not doing that. I've sat in this line for 3 hours. I'm here to vote. And then they call the police, and you're charged with what, a misdemeanor?
Yes, you could be. The way it was supposed to work at the election we're talking about is the election judges were supposed to let you vote, so they weren't supposed to send you home or anything like that. They were supposed to let you vote, but they were supposed to take your name and information down for potential prosecution in the future. So, like you said, it's only a misdemeanor, but the idea that you should get any charges
is outrageous.
For simply wearing something into the voting booth, into the polling place, we argue is a violation of the First Amendment.
And or you can be fined up to $5,000. Okay.
And now our client was actually delayed a few hours. And it turned out that the person who did that wasn't supposed to do that, but nonetheless, while the goal of this law is to protect people from being obstructed while they're voting, the only person that we're aware of that was obstructed was our client.
Aye.
Again, just for a time, and that's why our claim is not that he was denied the right to vote. We're arguing it's a First Amendment violation.
Detainment.
Well, it could be, but all we're arguing is that the First Amendment, or the law itself, without any other action, is a violation of the First Amendment.
Okay, so what do we have here? The lower courts. What? I hope I probably got this wrong, but the one lower court said you're right. This needs to be amended. It got appealed and went up to and then it was reversed, and now it's gone through the 8th Circuit, and then all of a sudden it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Correct?
Yeah, that's right. Well, there was a partial reversal, or the trial court ruled in our favor or said there wasn't enough evidence on one claim, and so it was sent back. So it went up and down a couple times. But the end result is that both lower courts, the trial court and the appellate court, ruled against our clients. And so we filed what's called a petition for a writ of certiorari. Basically, we asked the Supreme Court to review the case. The Supreme Court doesn't have to do that, and they only take a few cases each year. But this past Monday, the Supreme Court granted our request and agreed to hear the case. So we think we have a good shot. You never want to predict these kinds of things. It's always dangerous to do that. But this court has been very protective of the First Amendment, and we think that by taking the case, it suggests that they may be in a mood to reverse. But again, we think we got the right arguments. We think the law's on our side, but we'll just have to wait and see.
So is the objective, Oliver, to amend the statute ultimately, to have it more clarified, to have it not quite as broad, to, I guess, better define, what is in there? So, I mean, you don't necessarily start offending people and detaining them unnecessarily. Is that
right.
where we are?
Yeah, I think what the relief would be if we win would be this particular part of the statute would be invalidated, and then it would be up to Minnesota and the other states, presumably, although they're not directly impacted by this case, but certainly other people could challenge those laws once we get a ruling in this case. And so it'll be up to Minnesota to change the law in a way that meets the First Amendment standard, as the Supreme Court will hopefully say.
Oliver, has this type of law been challenged in any other state, or is this one that, the trigger got pulled in Minnesota?
Now, there are some other states, and we've cited some opinions. It's not a widely litigated issue, but there have been cases. An Oregon appellate court ruled in our favor, or ruled in the way we like, and said that merely passive speech like this is not, or deserves protection under the First Amendment, is not an unreasonable infringement on anyone's right to vote. And that opinion, interestingly, mentioned going all the way back to Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, people wearing bandanas and other things like that. And so there's a long history of long tradition in this country of people wearing political clothing and other things when they go vote.
Well, I mean, it's one of the most patriotic things you could do. I mean, it's almost, in some cases, it's almost like a national holiday, and so you might want to wear red, white, and blue. There's a fella who, and it may be your client, that had a T-shirt on that said, "Please ID me" on it. It had nothing to do with, one party or another. It was just, "Please ID me." What happened there?
Well, that's right, and that was our client was involved in
for voter ID.
Right, and the argument there would be to give the state its best argument is that they said that was provocative because, as you know, the idea of IDing people at the polling place is controversial, but in this case, there was no ballot initiative. There was nothing on the ballot related to that. So the Minnesota voters were not being asked to approve any kind of state constitutional amendment or any referendum to require IDing people at the polling place. Nor was our client wearing anything related to a particular candidate or any other issue that was on the ballot. Mm-hmm. So one of the arguments is if you're, again, campaigning, or if you're wearing clothing that relates to potentially an issue or a candidate, the state argues that kind of speech can be restricted more so than other kinds of speech. But that argument doesn't even work in this case because, again, none of the issues or candidates was on the ballot. And so the "Please ID me" pin was just a general statement unrelated to the Minnesota ballot that year. Obviously, it was a political expression, but that's precisely why it should be protected.
Now, does this Minnesota statute, do they do public service announcements in the state of Minnesota, for the 6 weeks leading up to voting day, because you can vote early, you can vote absentee and all this other kind of nonsense. But, nonetheless, you can get your ballot in the mail. Some people just go deliver it. Do they have the stipulations in there so people, don't get blindsided when they walk into a voting location and, you got this, Make America Great hat on and you can't wear that. So they know the do's and don'ts already?
Yeah, you know what? I don't know that. And one reason I suspect this came up is because it was enforced in this case. There was the Secretary of State issued a recommendation or a policy, and one of the exhibits to our brief was a memo from the county elections manager to all the election judges in the county where our client voted, and that set forth all the rules that they were supposed to execute, and so those are the ones that I read you earlier, where they identified the political parties and the Tea Party and MoveOn.org. So it was an official policy of the state carrying this out. But as to whether the state previously or ever has publicized what you're allowed to wear in the voting booth, I don't know.
Or there might be some kind of signs that go, this is a restricted speech zone, a restricted free expression zone. You rope it off. When you cross this line, you can't. These are the do's and don'ts.
Right, yeah, right.
Otherwise, don't cross this line.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know, but right. I mean, they could say, please make sure your phones are off when you're in the polling place.
I understand that one.
Yeah, but that wouldn't be. I mean, I suppose somebody could make an argument, but I'm not sure that's political expression, unless maybe you're playing the Star Spangled Banner or something. But even then, the issue there would be the disruption, not the speech. So what you're regulating in that case, we would argue, is the conduct, is the disruption of the voting process. Yeah. Whereas when you're telling someone someone can't wear a T-shirt, you're not restricting any conduct there. You're not restricting anything that's infringing anyone's
behavior.
Behavior, and you're not, and the person who's wearing that shirt isn't bothering anybody. So there's no need to restrict in that case.
Well, but what's kind of interesting is I read something here that says that these voting locations, or that's done by the Secretary of State or the director or manager of the state election commission or department, is they want to maintain peace, order, and decorum. So what they're doing is they're saying you can't have any part of the your passive First Amendment rights, because we don't want any kind of potential that might be against the peace, order, and decorum in these voting polls. So I guess that
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, all I was going to say is, turn off the cell phone. Don't chew gum. Don't have taps on your shoes. You have to come in and soft.
Right, and it's almost like you are responsible for how other people respond to your clothing.
Yeah.
Instead of putting the burden on other people to behave when they're in the voting booth, it's your responsibility to make sure. It's the trendy new word now is it's your responsibility not to trigger anyone else.
All right. Well, when does the Supreme Court take up this case?
We don't have a definite schedule yet, but we expect it'll be heard this term, which means since we're at the end of 2017, it'll be heard in sometime 2018, and we expect a decision by the end of June next year. So not that far off.
This is really so. When these lawsuits happen, I mean, there was a case. It was the Minnesota Voters Alliance versus who was this person?
Mansky. He's the elections manager for the county.
Okay, so you sued the elections manager, but not the Secretary of State. Is that right?
I think we did name Secretary of State at some point, and I should clarify. We Pacific Legal Foundation got involved after the appellate courts ruled.
Okay.
There was another attorney who worked the case through the district courts and the appellate courts. We took over on appeal.
How long, Oliver, has this statute been born? How long has it been around?
I don't know exactly, but it's been around for quite some time. It was part of a broad amendment to the voting statutes in Minnesota. But again, it to my knowledge.
So is that like 10 years? You're thinking?
At least.
Okay.
But as far as I know, it had not been challenged in this form. And probably, again, I'm not sure about this, but I find it hard to believe it was enforced very, very much. I think we would have heard about it if it had been routinely enforced, or if they were, like you said, if they were announcing this in advance over and over again. I think it would have made the news.
So are we thinking that we had some kind of rogue poll workers there, or something?
I mean this was the stated policy, but I think the rogue, if anything was the rogue action, it was the when it delayed our client for a couple hours from voting. That was not supposed to take place. That was not part of the official policy. So if anything, that was the problem. But again, he was allowed to vote, so his rights were delayed a little bit, but not invalidated or voided. So, but nonetheless, the point is that that kind of discretion can be dangerous, and we don't think this happened in this case, but it's possible that an individual election judge could not like either a certain political party, might not like the Tea Party, might not like the AFL-CIO, and could enforce it selectively. And that's the danger, and that's why we think the law is overbroad. It covers much more speech than is necessary to maintain an orderly polling place.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of cures for this too. I mean, they could hand somebody a ballot and just say, here, fill it out over here, and you can maintain some kind of, peace, order, and decorum. So you don't have, you don't have the risk of, offending somebody or getting into some kind of, verbal confrontation or even physical altercation. I mean, the whole thing is nuts, but I kind of go back to this confusion and undue influence. I mean, people, maybe we need to have people just take a test, or do you know who you're voting for? Or these are the issues. I mean, everybody sends out sample ballots. It's full page ads in the newspaper. They talk about it on TV. And
if everyone voted home, then you wouldn't be bothered.
Or something. So is this a situation where Pacific Legal Foundation actually goes to, sends a representative to the Supreme Court and that it gets argued, or are they just looking at the documents and the paper trail of the lower courts and they just render a decision? I mean, is there a chance for argument here or no?
Yeah, we have a chance now to submit another round of briefing. Okay. So we'll have an opening brief. The state can respond, and then we'll have a reply, and then sometime after that there will be oral arguments, and then the opinion.
Fascinating.
So we don't know how long it takes, but it's kind of fun. We were waiting. We filed our petition to the Supreme Court, and it was what's called relisted. They didn't decide to grant or deny it, and I think it happened 4 or 5 weeks in a row. And so finally we got it, and when the lead attorney was, of course, thrilled, and so were our clients.
Well, congratulations on this. Something to certainly watch out for, because it will affect at least 10 other states, and I think it has far-reaching implications. Whatever decision it is will be read by probably every kind of attorney I can think of. But Oliver Dunford, you've been stellar at this, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, and if your listeners want to check us out, it's pacificlegal.org. Thanks so much for having me on.
Happy to do it, ladies and gentlemen. There's more coming your way, so stay tuned.
You can't handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. CEAD, over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. CEAD, out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie, 4 Tree 5, 9er 21. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie, 47 Tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 5-3U.
Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. You know, I often have a lot of the lawyers from the Pacific Legal Foundation on as guests to talk about cases that they work on, but very rarely, in fact, I think never until this moment have I had one of their clients on with us. And I am so gratified to have Donna Murr on with us, who's from Wisconsin. And her particular case had to deal with property rights. And thank you, Donna, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. You've had a saga that I bet you didn't think it would end up this way, did you?
No, I didn't think I would have the saga even starting. I didn't know my property rights could be violated the way they were. So, yes, it's been a long battle, about 15 years.
I was going to say, I just was looking at the date. It looked like it began in 2004.
Yeah, actually 2002 is when it started. The legal battle started in 2006, but our battle with the county and the Board of Adjustment and battling over the definition of the ordinances started back in 2002. So 15 years at it.
I don't want to steal your thunder, Donna. So if you would give a thumbnail sketch on what you were attempting to do, and why you weren't allowed to do it.
Sure. Well, like I said, our battle started 15 years ago, but our story goes all the way back to 1960, and that's when my parents bought some property in a residential development along the St. Croix River in Wisconsin. 66 lots in the development, so they kind of were living the American dream, where they bought a place and built a cabin, and they enjoyed it so much that 3 years later, when the empty lot next door was still for sale, they bought that too, in hopes of building their retirement home on that lot, and then leaving the cabin next door for us kids. So life went on, and we enjoyed the cabin for so many years, and we just left that empty lot undeveloped until 1994, when my father suffered a stroke, and that made him unable to enjoy the cabin any longer. So Mom and Dad decided they would gift us the cabin, which they did, and then a year later they gifted us the empty lot next door, so then we could do what we wanted with that as well. So 2002 comes around, and my brothers and sisters and I, so there's 6 families, 6 of us families own the property now. We decided we wanted to sell the empty lot, which at that time was assessed and appraised for $400,000. A beautiful piece of property, 100 feet of beachfront along the river. We were going to cash in on Mom and Dad's investment, so to speak, and use that money to fix up our cabin, which was now over 40 years old. It's 950 square feet, and it just needed some repairs. So we walk into the county offices and tell them about our plans and ask about what kind of permits and what kind of variances we might need to do the kind of work we wanted on the cabin. And that's when they told us that back in the 1970s, an ordinance was passed that merges commonly owned properties into one parcel. And we just looked at them and said, well, what are you talking about here? We get 2 property tax statements.
I was going to ask that
separately.
Yeah.
Yep, 2 statements for all those years. We're assessed separately. The plat maps still show 2 lots. You know, the whole residential development, that area I mentioned earlier, was all developed except for our 1 lot. And so we were just perplexed by the fact that the government could merge your property together without your consent or knowledge, for that matter. I mean, they did nothing to indicate to us that they merged our properties together, especially in fact that they allowed my parents to give us the property one year and the other property the other, when the merger was supposed to have taken place in the 70s. So we weren't happy with that result, Denise, as you might imagine, because, you know, we had a piece of property we thought we could sell. And they told us we could only sell the empty, undeveloped property if we sold the cabin with it. And we're like, well, no, that's not how this is supposed to work. So we challenged the ordinance, and we sued for what's called a regulatory taking, meaning the regulations basically took our property away. It now was basically to us useless and had very little value. Unfortunately, the district court threw out our case on summary judgment. We appealed to the Wisconsin Appeals Court, and they ruled against us. We appealed to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and they did not take our case. But I have a strong family, and we kept going back to what would Mom and Dad do, what would Mom and Dad do, and the answer was always they'd keep fighting, this isn't right, they'd keep fighting, this isn't right. Yep. So that's when we discovered, by the grace of God, the Pacific Legal Foundation. And they embraced our case. They recognized the injustice of the situation. They took us under their wing. And as you know, Pacific Legal Foundation does this for free because, let's face it, who can fight the government? It's costly. It's exhausting. It's, where is your right out? But because I had a big family, we could fight together and keep this going. So the Pacific Legal Foundation then petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court, and to our delight and amazement, they did select our case, which felt like a victory at that time, but then on June 23rd of this year, they ruled against us on a 5-3 vote. So very disappointing. Still feeling like, well, this still isn't right.
Let me stop you there. Let me stop you there. Did the U.S. Supreme Court rule on the law, or did they just rule on your case?
Well, they ruled that there's something, and this is going to get a little bit more legal than maybe I'm comfortable with, Denise.
Fair enough.
The parcel, the ruling in essence was, did we have one parcel or did we have two parcels? And what was taken from us? And they felt as if nothing was taken because we still had two parcels.
Ownership. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. So then, much to my delight and surprise again, on the same day that we received the unfortunate news from the Supreme Court, I got a call out of the blue from one of my state representatives here in Wisconsin by the name of Adam Jarko. He's not in my district, and nor is he in the district where my property is located. So this was truly out of the blue, and he had been watching the case. Mm-hmm. He's also an attorney. And he said, Donna, I have legislation ready to propose that's going to fix the injustice that just happened with the Supreme Court. And I started crying.
Aww.
My hero came through. And so he introduced what they called the Homeowners Bill of Rights here in Wisconsin on July 20th. And basically, in a nutshell, there's a lot of great stuff in that bill. But the part that was most important for my family is that the bill will prohibit the government from merging properties without the owner's consent, which I thought all along was obvious. To me, it was like, well,
Shucks.
Isn't that the way it should have always been? So the bill was passed last week in both the Senate and the Assembly, and we're waiting for Governor Scott Walker to sign the bill. Basically any day now. We're waiting for the good news of when that date will be. So victory after 15 years, Denise, and I can't tell you what that feels like because I hadn't felt it before.
Jeez. Well, and in the meantime, what have you done with the cabin in the did the poor thing ever
right. Everyone asks that question, and of course, everyone's curious because we have done nothing with the cabin. It still needs repair. It still needs fixing up. Now it's 57 years old, and so we're going to assess what we want to do, and we have to make a decision as a family because a lot's changed. Four of my older siblings are retired now. A lot changes in 15 years, so we'll figure it out. We're just so delighted that we will have our rights restored. We have the right to build, we have the right to sell, or we have the right to hold on to it, which is what I describe as being restored to what Mom and Dad thought back in 1963.
And it should have been all along.
Exactly.
I kind of did an internet search. I knew about your case because we had talked about it before on the show, but so this morning I did a search, and Donna, there were an awful lot of people that were watching this case, from the sublime to the ridiculous. I mean, I'm looking even when you have the Washington Post who writes up a piece about it. So it was a huge accomplishment that you got as far as you did, and meaning you brought enough attention to this. But this Bill of Rights for property owners that is now waiting for your governor's signature, it's got a lot of other interesting things in it. So your misery of all of these years has actually been a benefit to people in your state. And I would argue for case law now and for other state legislatures, you have probably helped protect the same kinds of things across the country. Did you realize that?
Well, that's been my dream all along, Denise, is that winning at the Supreme Court would have made a difference for the country.
Yeah.
So it was so disappointing. But now in Wisconsin, I really feel that other states are going to follow our lead and make a difference and get their own laws changed as well, and set the momentum for the rest of the country, because it is so important that people don't take their property rights for granted, and that with the whisk of a pen and an ordinance just like that, your rights can be violated. And like you mentioned, this Homeowners Bill of Rights does have a lot of great things in it. I think a lot of my neighbors at our cabin are going to thank all of the people involved in getting this bill passed, because it helps everybody when their time comes to do repairs on what are called non-conforming cabins, which are smaller places. Like ours, our place is 950 square feet. Well, it doesn't conform any longer, but it's still perfect for our family. But before this bill was passed, or before this bill, if we wanted to fix it up, we'd need like 8 variances. This bill is going to eliminate all that red tape. If you need to repair or rebuild a non-conforming structure, do it, which seems obvious to me. That should be the way it should be all along. But there's a lot of really good things in this bill to help people to protect their property. And, if they bought what's called a substandard lot, and that's what we have too. Even though our lot is 1 acre, it's now considered substandard. Even though every other lot in the development is 1 acre, they passed an ordinance and they want larger lots. Well, just because we have a substandard lot, we're grandfathered in and we're still able to develop it, which it should be like that. So there's a lot of great things in this Homeowners Bill of Rights besides just this merger provision, which, of course, to us is the most important.
Donna, beyond your particular ownership in this case, what did you learn about the whole bureaucracy over the last 16 years? Did you just say?
Yeah. Well, everything. It's interesting you bring that up, because going through the court system, it seemed like everything took forever. You got extensions and filing briefs, and it just goes on and on and on. But then when we got to, we lost through the court system, now we're going through the legislative branch. I still can't believe that the bill was introduced July 20th, and it passed on November 7th. So the people in Wisconsin, and Adam Jarko and Tom Tiffany, the 2 authors of the bill, they pushed that thing through, and here we are. So it was super slow in the courts. But I did learn a few things. Not have ever been involved in politics in my life, and I'm 54 years old. I did everything everyone says you should do. Contact your representatives, email them, call them, and all of those sorts of things. And it's amazing how little reaction and feedback I got. I was disappointed in my own state senator from my district. 5 times I reached out. I never got so much as a return phone call. Requested a meeting to talk to her about this legislation, and she was one of 3 senators that voted no against it. So I found out that politics is frustrating, and I understand why people don't like it, because you call your representatives and they don't call you back and give you the time of day. That part was very disappointing. But then, like I said, I have heroes that weren't in my district that got the job done fast. So that was truly amazing that we're sitting here in November when a bill was just introduced in July. And like I say, any day now, Governor Walker hopefully will be signing it sometime before the end of the year.
Well, at your expense, it was a public service that you performed, and you probably at some point began to realize that, but certainly going in, you probably had no idea. It is a sad commentary, because we think that we send representatives to Washington, D.C. They're civil servants, they work for us, but even in your case at the state level, they still work for you, and they are your state civil servants, and they weren't doing that until out of the blue you had kind of 2 heroes that walked in.
Right. Yeah, because I actually started this process of trying to get the laws changed way back in 2002 and 2003. I contacted my representatives at that time. Unfortunately, I didn't live in Wisconsin. I lived in Minnesota, so therefore they didn't really give you the time of day, because you owned land in a different state that you couldn't vote in. So I realized quickly that I wasn't going to get anywhere because I didn't vote in that state. I moved to Wisconsin in 2005, but at that time the representatives too told me we won't be able to get anything passed because the balance of power. We had a Democratic governor, and the balance in the Senate was Democrat, and they said nothing would get passed. And I shook my head and I said, why does politics come into this? My family, there's 6 families, like I mentioned earlier, we're half lean left and half lean right, but we all agree on this. So why is it political? It's common sense. So so that part really annoyed me because I didn't feel that it should be one side or the other. It's the Constitution, it's property rights. It's obvious that the violation. So I was really dumbfounded that they thought the Democrats couldn't push this through, and so nobody was interested in it. And here we are with the balance of power shifted, with Governor Scott Walker being Republican and the Senate and Assembly in Wisconsin having the Republican power, and so it passed. And so I'm grateful, but I don't really understand that. Like I said, to me, it's not.
Sadly,
political.
now you do.
Yes, sadly now I do. Right.
Welcome.
So I've learned a lot.
And it's sad that you had to, but it's a good lesson to learn because that's just where we are. And being a property owner, I mean, there's 2 very sacrosanct things that we citizens have: the power to vote and the ability to own property and to do with this property what we want to do, being respectful to property values. And for the state to come in and kind of say, hey, we know that you own this property, but all of a sudden you can't do this and you can't do that, then your property, just because of some kind of statute, loses its value. And so at some point they really owed you money, right?
That's it, exactly. So they didn't assess us as one parcel until we sued for a taking. So they knew for 8 years when we were discussing with them that, we weren't in a position, we had 2 parcels and we were getting 2 statements, and they still sent us 2 statements and we kept paying it. But when they reassessed it, the value dropped by over $400,000, which is exactly what the assessor said would happen, and an independent appraiser. So we lost over $400,000 in value, just like you mentioned. I mean, that's
significant.
To say it, that's real money. And so, they said that, it's just excess land. If you can't build on it, it's not worth anything. It gives you a little bit more privacy, and yeah, you can have a picnic on it. Well, we don't want a picnic on it. We have a cabin. We don't need more area for picnics. We want to be able to sell it. So, yeah, it is just a fundamental right in a residential development that when you buy a lot, you can build on it, and the entire area is developed. So we truly were singled out and treated unfairly. When you look all along the river on both sides, we border with Minnesota. The entire Minnesota side of the river is developed, all along the St. Croix River on the Wisconsin side. So it just didn't make any sense that way back in 2003 and 4, when we applied for a variance for the ordinance, that common sense couldn't have prevailed, and the folks in St. Croix County couldn't have looked and said, you know what, one more lot isn't going to destroy anything or ruin anything or harm anybody. But they just weren't willing to budge on that, and it just is so frustrating. And so therefore we weren't willing to budge either, and we dug in our heels and we just kept plowing forward.
Well, and the interesting thing is that there were some powers within your state that could have signed a waiver, because at one point they created this statute after you own this property, after this property was in 2 parcels, so they could have signed a waiver, and you never would have had to go through more than a decade of legalness and stupidness.
Right. Legalness and stupidness. Yep. So the waiver is actually, we attempted that, and it's just asking for a variance to the ordinance.
Yeah.
And they said, no, take a hike. And we said, no, we're not taking a hike. We're going to keep fighting because this isn't right. And certainly they could have granted us a variance. That's the purpose of a variance, is to look at a situation on its own and decide if it makes sense to make an exception. And they decided, no exception for you people for whatever reason. And we said, well, that's just not fair. And I don't think that was the intent of the Constitution. So off we went.
Were you the first case like this, Donna, or had there been others that just decided not to fight?
Well, I'm not really sure about that. I mean, we did some research to try to find if there were other people around us that were in a similar situation, but most of the people that own or bought 2 lots in our development or close by, they built in the middle of 2 lots. So they didn't have an empty lot and a developed lot. They elected to merge their properties because they wanted to, which is great. They certainly can do that. So we didn't find anybody near us that had a situation like us. But that's not to say that there aren't a lot of people in the state of Wisconsin where there's lots of lakes and lots of rivers where families own cabins. I know a lot of people who own 2 cabins next to each other, and they would be forced under the same situation. So we were able to identify 4 or 5 families that own 2 cabins, and I let them know, if you want to sell 1 cabin, you have to sell both cabins. And they look at you like, what? And I'm like, yep. If this ordinance, stays intact someday when, in the future you want to sell one of your cabins, you're going to be told the same thing we were, that your properties were merged together. And so that, I think, is more of an issue in Wisconsin, is families that buy adjoining cabins, not necessarily empty lots and cabins like our situation. So there's a lot of folks out there that don't even realize that their rights were violated, like we didn't know until we actually wanted to exercise our right. And that's what was so frustrating, is they were more than happy to send us 2 property tax statements, and if we didn't fight or go in to try to sell our lot, we'd still be paying on 2 property taxes, and they'd be gladly collecting taxes on a lot that they are over-assessing us on. And, of course, we tried to argue we should be reimbursed for back taxes, and they pretty much just laugh at you.
Oh!
Right?
Oh!
So there's no recourse. You can only go back 1 year, and they said, well, you should have protested your property taxes.
Yeah,
and I said, why would I protest them? I thought they were right. You protest if you disagree, right, Denise? So
I thought you were doing right by me. As a landowner, and you come to find out that you weren't. So can I get a refund? No.
Yeah. I said, well, I've always worked in the private sector, and if we ever find out that we overbill our customers, we send them a refund. And it's like, well, that's not how it works. And I said, oh, right?
I think there ought to be a little documentary. You're going to be challenged by Denise here that your family needs to do a documentary on all of this, because it is an indication of state bureaucracy and federal bureaucracy. And I'm reminded the neighbor lives directly across the street from me and directly next door to me. They both own 2 lots right next to each other. And so it's kind of an eyebrow raising condition. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Even if it's a backhanded victory, but congratulations and hat tip to Adam Jarko and Tom Tiffany. Remarkable story, and I'm just so pleased to actually speak to a real client of the Pacific Legal Foundation. You've done a great job and a service to all kinds of landowners across the country.
Well, thank you. It feels good to make a difference. And like I've said from the beginning, Mom and Dad would have done the same thing. And I know they're very proud of us kids, that they raised good kids to stand up for themselves. We stuck together.
Yay.
Like I always say, we don't agree on everything, but by golly, we all agreed on this, and we're victorious together, and it feels pretty good. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. There's more coming your way.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Hi, this is Denise Simon, the host of the Denise Simon Experience. I feel compelled to tell you people that Don Newen is my favorite talk radio host, period. Not Mark Levin, not Rush Limbaugh. I can't do this.
Do it, Denise. Read it. Read it, Denise.
Not Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham, but yep, Don Newen. Cowboy Logic Radio is featuring the ever-stellar, highly gifted Don Newen, right here on Talk America Radio.
This is Don Newen with Cowboy Logic Radio. On behalf of my beautiful co-host, Donna Fiducia, I'd like to express my gratitude to Denise Simon for those kind words. I don't think I could have done it better if I would have written that myself. Cowboy Logic Radio, every Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, right here on Talk America Radio.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is AJ Gaynor, host of Blow and Smoke. Who is AJ Gaynor? Well, he's formerly the drummer for national recording artist 12 Stones, who you've probably never heard of, but why does he have a show? Well, he's widely read, widely traveled, and he enjoys the search for new perspectives. Why should you listen? First, because this is not your father's talk show. Second, because the idea here is each week I sit down with you for about an hour, and we discuss some current events, usually the political ones, but not always, and we try and identify what's real, and of course, what's the propaganda. We know the mainstream media has a narrative they're pushing, and on Blow and Smoke, we challenge that narrative, sometimes with simple facts, other times with instinctive logic, but always with truthful, honest debate. I've always said that my show is about finding perspective. I believe the perspective I provide my listeners is indeed unique. Tune into Blow and Smoke with yours truly, AJ Gaynor, right here on the Talk America Radio Network and at talkamericaradio.us.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
KTA Digital Dallas, Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia, and WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
And thanks for staying with us, ladies and gentlemen, here on the Denise Simon Experience. In our last segment, I've called on a buddy who knows probably tax policy and spending policy better than anybody that's in my circle, and that's Tom Del Beccaro. Tom is a business attorney based out of San Francisco. Yep, there are conservatives out there. You just have to look hard for them. He's a very successful author. He's a previous president of the California Republican Party, and he does a lot of good work over at Forbes and several other media outlets. On top of that, he has his own online magazine, which is politicalvanguard.com, and I certainly invite you to join up over there and see what all his contributors have to offer, of which I am occasionally one of them when I get my act together. So, Tom, thank you for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, you have great pieces in there. I can't believe all the information you discover, but at least someone's out there digging through it all.
Thank you. I do dig. I absolutely do that. And in fact, what prompted me to tap you on the shoulder to have you appear with us on the Denise Simon Experience is I was digging around, and I decided to trot on over to Treasury last night and see what Treasury's doing. We have part of a tax policy that has passed the House, with only Republicans voting for it, naturally. And I think we're advancing out of one committee, the Senate side. So having said that, we don't know where the two shall merge. But that's from a tax standpoint. When you visit Treasury and you start looking at a spending thing, it's enough to blow your head off. And what was particularly fascinating, Tom, is some of these line items on here you'd have to have a lawyer, which is the other reason I necessarily tapped you on the shoulder, is to figure out what they really mean by some of these line item entries.
Well, yeah, realize there's two parts of government, all that it does, and then the taxation to pay for part of what it does, because they run perennial deficits. That's what big governments do. And we were chatting a bit yesterday. Government is not business. You could never run your business like a government and last for very long. So there's a study years ago that demonstrated that you could put there's 84 welfare programs, and really you could consolidate them under 4. But, those in government have no incentive to do that. There's those working in government for whom it's a paycheck, so they wouldn't want it streamlined. And there's, more importantly or more destructively, there are those in power who hand out the government programs or appropriate for them, or really the final straw is that's their constituency. So the Democrats, who I'm talking about obviously, want these programs because, as Obama said 15, 20 years ago, you can create a working majority off those dependent on government. And so it doesn't matter to them that we have 84 welfare programs and redundancy, because as long as someone is dependent on it, that's a vote. And so they have no desire to run a streamlined operation. They have no desire to save taxpayers money. Their only desire is to have programs on which people are dependent, and then on whose vote they can depend.
I was traveling around looking at the China Silk Road project, and what that vision is for China in, I don't know, to 2030 or 2050, whatever it is, and the cost allocation for that. And I think without a lot of fanfare, just in recent days, that our deficit actually hit the $20 trillion mark. The China Road thing, which goes from China all the way into Europe and all the power plants and all the other, doesn't even cost that. So I sat here and said to myself, I don't think I have a concept of what $20 trillion really is.
No, it's incomprehensible, and that's part of the problem.
And then that is not really the total deficit, is it?
Well, there's long-term obligations. We've now surpassed $1 trillion in Social Security spending each year. $1 trillion. Well, if you think about what are likely, what we're going to live to, I think they estimate that people born today are all they're going to live over 100. What are we now? 40 years of retirement benefits? No, we have a couple $100 trillion in long-term obligations. How do you pay for that? You don't. You're in California. I mean, it's waiting to what's waiting to happen. 20 trillion is a big number. The number you care about is as it relates to your GDP. So if your gross domestic product was 500 trillion and you had 20 trillion in debt, you wouldn't yet be concerned. But because our national debt exceeds the total size of our economy and grows and grows, and we talked about all these long-term liabilities, this is where Greece comes in. And of course, those in office today say that can't happen to the United States, but the exact same lead-up things are happening. Greece went over its GDP in debt, just like we are. So we're on the same path. The question is, what you're talking about, why are all the government spending, and what are they doing about it? Do they have any desire to clean it up and avoid the apocalypse, the financial apocalypse?
Tom, regardless of what we necessarily spend in 36 pages worth of nonsense, line item by line item, we can't necessarily afford to even service the debt today at 20 trillion, much less what it will be in 5 years and how you service the debt then.
Yeah, well, so by all reasonable projections, especially if we continue to grow at almost no economic growth at all, which is where we've been for a decade, under 2%. What you're looking at is, in 10 years, Social Security, Medicare, defense, and the interest on the debt, and nothing else. And so we have to start cutting spending, paying down the debt, in order to survive. Now, look, the model for this is pretty simple. It's Detroit. What happened in Detroit in January of 2013, and I talk about this in my book, The Divided Era, they simply woke up without money in the bank. And they just started cutting services because they could no longer afford to care for the parks and other items. Now, of course, the federal government has the option of printing money, which leads to more of what we're talking about in Greece or what happened in Argentina, where they print money, devalue the money, then you get inflation, and things really get bad.
In Venezuela.
But, yes. So sooner or later, you have to reckon with the fact that we cannot keep up this spending, and that's why last Sunday, when the Treasury Secretary said we're not really focused on that issue right now, i.e. spending, it was such a horrible thing to say. They should always be focused on that. In fact, why haven't the Republicans started the process of reforming some government programs?
Well, I think their first ride out of the chute was repealing Obamacare because it is so sizable. And from a spending standpoint, I don't believe that anybody in government has been able to put a true, comprehensive, complete dollar value on what Obamacare has cost the taxpayer since it was born.
Well, they don't specialize in releasing damaging information, right? And they don't even know. Even Denise, even a small state like California, compared to the federal government, years ago when Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor, he did one of these committees to determine, how to save money. And one of the things that they were requested to do was catalog all the commissions in the state so that they could review them. And right at the outset of the report, the committee to look into committees said one of the hardest things to do with the entire thing was to figure out
what a committee is.
How many of those committees existed? They couldn't even do it because it was so difficult finding it out. So, yes, this is what government does. This is what Steve Bannon talks about when he talks about the bureaucratic state, because it exists almost independent of the rest of government. I mean, they just spend and exist, almost without oversight. And of course, we can't keep going that way. We're going to go bankrupt. It's a question of if, not if, but a question of when.
And well, on paper, given the 20 trillion in debt and then the trillions that are in, the hundreds of trillions that are in unfunded mandates, I would say the train wreck is here. We have hit a wall. The only thing that is sustaining us is the ability to print money. Period. I mean, I don't see it any other way. I mean, we don't have the revenue stream that can begin to, one, service the debt, much less pay down the debt, without eliminating 50% of government. And you can't do that when you talk about the entitlements, you talk about Obamacare, you talk about defense, you talk about Social Security. I mean, it cannot be done. All of a sudden, if you eliminated everything but obviously defense, you might be able to cut some of the pain by a factor of maybe 25 or 30%, but I don't think it would be any more than that. It's just too big. Did I overstate it?
I think you're off by 2 or 3 or 5 years, but
okay.
So what?
Yeah, all right. Thank you.
I mean, these predictions. Patrick Henry made these predictions that the federal government would swallow us one day. He was off by a number of years, but not. Essentially, you're correct. If we were a normal business, we would be in bankruptcy. But because government, the way it can, quote, finance itself, first of all, it's lying about the rate of inflation. And the value for government lying about the rate of inflation is it can therefore keep interest rates low by keeping interest rates, just for instance, if we were measuring CPI, Consumer Price Index, like we did in 1980, the current inflation rate would be 9%. If we did it, there's 1 year in between, I'm not remembering, it would be at 5%, but it's measured at 1.5%, 2% now because they took out volatile items, the stuff you use, so, like food, or changed it to diminish their impact on the overall amount. So by doing that, they can keep interest rates low because when you have high inflation, one of the ways government battles high inflation is to raise interest rates to tamp down activity. Well, that doesn't fit in with what the need that you described, which is to print money to allow government to continue to spend beyond its means. And so what they do is they lie about the level of CPI, and that allows the central bank, the Fed, to keep interest rates ultra low, and interest rates when they're ultra low allows them to run these deficits because they don't really have to pay for that money because interest on the debt is so low. If it was at 9%, we'd be in crisis already.
I would argue that where the interest rates are, they've creeped up ever so slightly, but that tells you that there is not any confidence in recovery, right?
What do you mean confidence in recovery? Sorry.
That if the interest rates went, to 3% or 5% or whatever, it creeped up a whole percentage point, which is really, they're saying they're not doing that because they don't think they have the confidence that we're not recovering. We're told that we're recovering, but we're not really recovering. If we were, their interest rates would go up a little, right? I mean, there was a time that you could put money in the bank and you would earn some kind of interest. Right now, the banks are running negative interest on the money that you keep in your bank. That's insanity.
Yeah, in a way, that's true, but they have a conflict of interest here. They're not. The reality that you describe, they don't want to kill off the recovery. That's right. True, and they also don't want to run up the deficit because if they raised interest rates, they'd have to pay more money on what they're borrowed, and that would blow the deficit. So it's a double whammy. So their policy isn't. They don't raise interest rates to tamp down inflation, which might be a good thing to do, but because their greater conflict in need is to not blow the deficit. And so the result of all of this is that the stock market's at record highs because the normal way people saved money in years past was to put money in savings accounts. But because interest rates are so low, there's no point in putting money there. So we've come accustomed in the last decade to putting it in the stock market, which will eventually have to be reckoned with when these more cataclysmic financial events you described come to pass.
Yeah, when there's going to have to be some kind of correction, and I would say it would be almost catastrophic when some kind of correction begins. Now, since when people are not using, savings and loans are just gone. People have some monies in the banks, but how is it these banks could even lend money if there's nothing in reserve? Are they operating off of, a false balance sheet, or have the restrictions been lifted?
Well, as a historic matter, and we've had a checkered banking past. Most of the time, banks were in the early part of our country's history. It was state bank. The states regulated the banks. Now there's more federal regulation. And look, they're not required. When you put $100 in the bank, they're not required to keep $100 there. They can loan it back out. The higher that reserve amount, the less they loan out. The less you find the economy won't have as much activity. So what they do is they keep a lower reserve amount. If you keep that reserve amount at a very low amount, then you have a big risk if there's a bank run. But that's not really the risk that they're worried about right now.
Well, you can have a bank run, but in steps the government, because it's been, as you said, taken over by the feds, essentially.
Yeah, because the federal government
Reserve
guarantees your deposits up to $100,000, and therefore, quote, you feel okay about the notion that if somehow your bank went under, so you don't run like during It's a Wonderful Life, you don't run to the bank to go get your money. But the problem is, if we ever got to that situation where the Federal Reserve would have to pay you your $100,000, you have so many other problems like rampant inflation and the like, that it would be a very ugly situation.
And they did have bank runs in Greece. Remember, there wasn't too long ago. 3 or 4 years ago, they were putting restrictions on how much money you could get out of the ATM machine, and people were standing in line for 2 days to get $30 or whatever it was. Let's kind of circle back here to some spending. A lot of what I see in spending are like entitlement line items, but they're not really in the entitlement bucket, meaning that entitlements are actually worse than what we think.
Or there's more entitlements than people realize.
Exactly. And the one thing that very few speak of, Tom, is the student loan program. And
it's been taken over by the federal government. It used to be a process where you applied for a loan from a local bank or a national bank. I had a student loan from MBNA was the name of the bank. I remember it was $61 a month I had to pay on one loan, and what's double that? $122 on another. But now, essentially, they've run out that process, and now the federal government owns that industry, and and they promote it, and now we have kids with tons and tons of debt,
of which is
jobs.
being forgiven, so it becomes a grant.
Yeah, and the reason why they're demanding forgiveness is because, of course, there isn't economic growth to justify. I mean, they can't get jobs with high enough wages because we've had such weak economic growth. So that leaves, look, when government gets in the middle of some economic activity, it almost certainly will make it worse and institutionalize it in the long run.
I'm looking at a line item, Children's Health Insurance Fund, $14 billion. Why do we have to have that if we have Obamacare? Okay.
Okay, if you're going to start with why and is it rational, this is not a valuable.
It's mostly for the listeners, because I want them to be able to ask some of those questions.
Yeah, the reality is that these are redundant programs, right? You're correct. If we had all of that, but remember, Obamacare was really aimed at the individual market for people without other avenues for insurance. So if you had a job, Obamacare wasn't supposed to affect your job. If you have Medicare, Obamacare wasn't supposed to affect your job. If you have if you had insurance for your child, Obamacare wasn't supposed to get in there. But of course, it did affect the entire insurance market nationally. And so that was a pre-existing program which Obamacare was not meant to interrupt.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Tom. And if you want to understand kind of where we're going, you can trot on over to fiscal.treasury.gov and look at some of those reports over there, because it'll blow your head off. And Tom, thank you for your time.
And I know you're going to do an op-ed for Political Vanguard.
Okay, I'll get to it. Yes, sir, I will do that. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you again soon.